Hi, and thank you all for joining us today. We are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, I'm so grateful for you when you do. And of course, as you just heard, welcome to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled, where hopefully we can help you to discover your own truth. Today, we are broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, which is 105.3 on the Gulf Coast and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. And today, we're very excited to be able to welcome Dr. Simeon Hein to our show. Just a little bit about him. Real quick, and I'm going to have him tell you more about himself, of course. But Dr. Hein taught statistics to university undergrads and has a Ph.D. in sociology, emphasizing how humans interact with technology. He has written several books and was recently featured on the History Channel show In Search Of, which is epic. I love that show. And then in 1996, he started his own research and teaching company, the Mount Baldy Institute, to allow people to learn remote viewing, which is a type of intuitive training that taps into our creative, unconscious intelligence. And of course, there's so much more, and I'll have him explain it to you, but he also studies and lectures on crop circles. He has crop circle tours, and he also plays the guitar and writes music. So let's add him to the stage. Hi, Simeon.
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for having me here today.
Of course, it's my pleasure. I'm gonna step aside for a minute and have you talk about your background a little bit more in depth for folks, and also remind folks that I had interviewed you once before. We had a very interesting conversation. I thought it was great. And I'm going to put the link to that in the video description for folks so they can make sure they check that out as well. But go ahead and talk about yourself and your background, what you're doing now for a minute or two, and then I'll jump in with the questions.
Yes, well, thanks very much. You know, as you mentioned, I used to teach statistics and research methods. I was always concerned that there was a little bit of bias, more than a little bit of bias in statistics itself. It was based on these idea of averages and normalcy and kind of standardized measurements of reality. And it never quite sat right with me, I have to be honest, even though I took, got a PhD focused on, mathematical modeling methods. And I taught statistics as an assistant professor at WSU. But I always felt that these methods were like putting the cart before the horse. It was like saying, okay, we have these sort of linear models, and we're going to fit the world into these linear models. And when we look around us, we don't see this linearity in everything. I mean, you see it in a few things, and you see averages in physical systems. But once you start dealing with cultural systems, economic interactions, and the phenomena that I'm really interested now that we call the paranormal, you see a lot of nonlinear activity where small changes cause big effects, and that doesn't model at all into these linear regression models. So during graduate school, Caroline, I came across something called fractal geometry. These are like self-similar shapes that the way nature really looks like mountain ranges and trees and clouds and our arterial system and bronchial system, things that are always branching into smaller and smaller increments rather than resolving to lines. And, we're all around fractal systems now because it was incorporated into cell phone antennas. Cell phone antennas are based on fractals. There's even a company called fractenna.com. I just found this a couple of days ago looking into how fractals have developed, because you can, in a finite area, you can fit different sized antennas if you make them smaller and smaller and self-similar and get different bandwidths. Also JPEG images, which we use on computers all the time. Compressed images where you just sample some of the points and kind of use an algorithm to recreate what the picture sort of looks like. You know, if you magnify your JPEGs, it kind of looks a little grainy, but from a distance, it looks okay, and it saves a lot of bandwidth. So fractals are part of nature. They're a part of our technology now. And what that show us is that there are objects and processes, and I would say life forms between dimensions. And the definition of fractals are objects between dimensions. Before we get into a discussion of the topics that we're going to talk about today, objects like clouds are completely between dimensions because they're not completely 3D, because as you get closer and closer, you're just going to see water droplets. The space is not completely filled like a solid object. So they're fractal dimensions like 2.2, 2.3 dimensions, between 2 and 3. And just learning about fractals 30 some years ago, even longer, it showed me there may be phenomena that science had not been studying, that science had missed because it didn't fit neatly into the pre-existing linear normalized models. Even in statistics itself, the original founders of statistics have come under a great degree of criticism for making normalcy the standard of our scientific reasoning. And what is normal? Well, that's anyone's idea of what that is. It's going to vary between people and countries, even within a country, different ideas of what's ordinary, average, and normal. So that is where we can kind of lead off from here, is our view of reality has been constrained by these models that have had artificial ideas of averaging and normalcy and standardized distances, when even looking at fractal geometry and its sister science, chaos theory, showed us that nature could be much more complex than that, more simple at the same time, branching structures, and yet more complex because these systems don't resolve into processes that are necessarily easy to measure with a ruler or any standardized procedure. Mm-hmm.
Does that have anything to do with like the Fibonacci sequence in nature?
Yes,
it
absolutely.
does.
Yes, the Fibonacci series is a fractal type of pattern because it repeats at different scales.
Right.
And it's made by adding the previous number to the next, to the next number. And then you get the sequence, which approximates what we call a phi ratio, the ratio that our body and many systems, biological systems, are built around the Fibonacci series, what Leonardo da Vinci called the golden section, the golden rule. So that proportion has a very important legacy in our scientific and engineering traditions, since a few hundred years ago, that's what people understood to be sort of this ideal proportion, the Fibonacci series, that sort of growth ratio. But as we know, over the last 100 years, we've kind of moved away from the phi ratio golden section into what modern economics thinks of as more efficient structures built around boxy looking things. And our buildings moved away from things that look like the Parthenon, which has sort of a natural phi ratio built into it, and many other structures that feel that comfortable because they're based on a human scale, a human proportion, and how nature works, into more efficiency-oriented criteria, which builds things around boxy and rectangular structures. And they don't look and feel the same. I mean, if we pushed it to the extreme, we'd end up with what used to be Soviet architecture. If you had ever visited Eastern Europe, when I did before the Iron Curtain fell down, East Berlin and so forth, when there was a wall across Eastern Europe and right through the center of the city of Berlin, the the contrast in the architecture from the West Berlin to East Berlin was just stunning, because the East Berlin had this Soviet architecture, which is built around just very modernized idea of simplicity and ordinary mathematical additive proportions, non-fractal arrangements. And what do we know about the feeling of those types of buildings and cities built that way? Even Budapest in Hungary, prior to that shift in political arrangements, you looked at the Soviet architecture, and it just had this very cold, dehumanizing, alienating feeling. We've all seen pictures of this. So I'm just we don't have to go too much in that direction, but you kind of get the idea. Nature has a certain way of building things based on the Fibonacci series, which turns into fractal geometry and branching structures, which, like trees, to us feel very comfortable because we're modeled around that sort of system too. But in our minds, in the minds of modern economists and scientists, the ideal proportion was these very oversimplified geometrical shapes based on Euclidean geometry. And it turned our reality from something that was naturally resilient into something that was built more for efficiency. And as that efficiency mindset crept into science over the last 100 years, we started excluding topics that didn't easily fit into those types of models. That's my view of it. And as a result, we called all these phenomena paranormal, and we pushed them away and said they're weird and strange, and you won't get any funding for that. And now, the current time we're all living in right now, it's taken a big U-turn back to an interest, at least in now what we call UAP, what we used to call UFOs, so that Congress has gotten involved because we're actually ignoring witness experiences from the military, from the Navy, from the Air Force for decades. Even more recently, these so-called drone objects over your area on the East Coast, right? Where I talked to people who said, look, these things are hovering over my house all night, and it's making me feel really strange. They're right out my bedroom window. I can just see them there. What are they doing up there, Mr. Hein, all night? And I said, I wish I could tell you, because no one's telling us anything. So we have phenomena that exist that we refuse to look at because they're harder to explain. We've become sort of like the ostriches that proverbially, I don't know if they really do this, I guess somewhere they do this, ostriches that put their head in the sand. We became like that professionally, and it's caused our society, in my view, to really lag behind where we should be and where other countries are right now, because we don't want to look at any phenomena that kind of venture off outside the ordinary linear models. And if we do, we end up classifying them. So there are groups of scientists working on these, but they're hidden behind special access programs and various types of classification. You can see what's happened here.
Yeah,
We've gotten that effect with reality.
Yeah, Dolly says this formula is a mathematical expression of light transmission. It explains how light transforms matter. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, you could look at it that way, because the Fibonacci series is really built into so many types of energetic and material processes. You can find it everywhere. You can find it right in your finger digits, in the bone structure throughout your body. If the first digit, if you just say that's a length of 1, the next digit will be 1.6 times the length of the first digit. The next digit is 1.6 times the length of the second digit, all throughout your body. So this is how nature builds things. In our particular reality, maybe in another reality, it would use a different proportion. But for us, that ratio is important, and it leads to fractal geometry. And if we look at things that way, these processes and objects that are between dimensions, the fractals used to be called mathematical monsters. Even the mindset of 100 years ago, 150 years ago, mathematicians wanted to say, well, those are weird, repeating, iterative shapes, and we can't make sense of them because they always sort of lead to different outcomes. We'll just call them monsters and put them in the closet. And Now the monsters have escaped from the closet and they're in our cell phones
Right.
as antennas. But the point is, in my view, they describe a lot of other processes of real monsters that we haven't wanted to look at, and very interesting uh, psychic phenomena. Now it's more recently, just like Caroline, just like UFOs became relabeled UAP,
Yeah,
remote
yeah.
viewing and psychic phenomena have now been relabeled as psionics, we're told, from people
Oh,
that
yeah.
work
That's
in these
one of the
psionics.
topics.
So it has a new name, and now it's okay to talk about. It's not spooky and weird. It's the same thing, but anyway.
Yeah, that's one of the topics where I definitely have a question for you about. But it's so, like, I just realized too that even our technology, everything is very square. I mean, in graphics, we do see some circles and some pretty designs that are similar to nature, what you'd find in nature. But the shapes of our monitors, our computers, all of our tech is designed, like you said before, in a very boxy, square, prison-like kind of way.
Exactly. Now,
Yeah.
that can work in some systems very well. I mean, honestly, if you want to get to the moon, you don't want anything to be outside the range of your prediction the whole way there and the whole way back, all the way to the landing systems. And as we've seen now more recently in private space venture companies, you got to get everything right or it doesn't work. And
Yeah.
it'll be very expensive and the people may not come back. We saw this with the shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986. I remember seeing that when I was a student at the University of Arizona, which had a big astrophysics and astronomy department. So a tiny little crack in some of the tiles and the temperature change can lead the performance to be different. And all of a sudden you got a little bit of flame leaking out, disaster. So in some systems, we want those efficiency criteria. But the danger of making everything build everything around these efficiency criteria is something that the author and philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the author of the Black Swan books and Anti-Fragile and a whole bunch of other books about the consequences of using these limited statistical models, is they're not resilient. They are very subject to fragility and they break easily. Using that shuttle, the Challenger, as just an example, you go below a certain threshold, even in Florida, where it launched from, and it doesn't work anymore. So we have this trade-off between effectiveness and anti-fragility and efficiency criteria. But because we've become so short-term oriented in our particular society, I've been to other societies that have a longer view. I taught remote viewing 5 different occasions in Japan. There are societies that have a bigger, longer view. But for some reason, especially here in the US, we became very oriented towards the short term. These criteria, that the way we evaluate things, got condensed from decades to years to quarters, the way many companies evaluate their performance. And if you have to justify your performance every quarter, you're less likely to take risks and develop new ideas and products and services that may take longer to actually kind of come to fruition, because you're constantly up against these efficiency criteria. So it leads to a type of fragility in these systems where processes and organizations and systems that you and I have been around for decades have these Achilles heels in them. They can really break in a big way that you and I have never seen in our lifetimes. I encountered one of these types of black swan events in Boulder, Colorado, where I spend most of my time. And it was that flood in 2013 where it just started raining one day. And that weather system kind of got trapped in the mountains there, and it just didn't stop raining for 5 days. And the systems there, the drainage systems, the mountains had had a fire the previous year, so there was a lot of dirt ready to start sliding. Yeah, led to what they called a 500-year flood, something that doesn't happen in, once every 500 years. There's no one is alive who's ever experienced this before, and no one really knew how to do it. Neighbors began fighting with each other to divert water from your side of the street to my side of the street. Cars were washed away. You're familiar with this. That's the type of event that we lose sight of when we're too much focused on the short term and we're not really looking at these larger patterns, realizing that they can happen to catastrophic effect.
Yeah, I mean, we see that a lot too with the fires and the floods in North
Right.
Carolina. Everything
Exactly.
that's devastating, terrible. So your book, I read it. Excellent, excellent read, and I'll put the link to where folks can get a copy. It's called Black Swan Ghosts,
Oh,
a
yeah.
a new understanding of UFO ghosts and unexplained events. I loved it. It was
Yeah.
such an
Oh, thanks very
excellent.
much. Yeah.
And I know that I read the original version and then I read the revised version because of all the stuff that's going on right now. So that was great that you had an updated, and you
Oh,
also
thanks
have.
for reading. Yeah. Right. It's
Oh,
revised. Yep.
yeah, and I loved how you connected videos on your website
Oh,
to
thanks
it
very
as well.
much.
Speaking of your website, I always love doing this because so much work goes into all the work that you do. And I want folks to be able to check out your website. And, you have all your links to your YouTube
Yeah.
videos and all your other content on here. And this page here is what links, I think, to your book. Am I correct? The videos?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
all
So,
the links are at the top there, and all the book websites for each of the books that I've written, including, Opening Minds, Dark Matter Monsters, Planetary Intelligence. They all have their own websites. And I really appreciate you saying this, Caroline, because it takes a lot of work to create websites and maintain them and update them constantly. There are always new threats that pop up in PHP code and things like this. So you can't just create them and walk away because they will stop working, and even malicious code after a couple of years if you haven't updated them properly. Yeah. Well, I appreciate this because they do take a lot of work, and I want to make sure that my readers get access to the videos and the original information that led me to write these books, so you can see it for yourself and make your own decisions. These witness interviews are just stunning. We've heard about the Arrow organization within the
oh, yeah.
Pentagon that Congress mandated exist so they could start evaluating more recent UFO, UAP cases. And I think a lot of these witnesses that I interviewed some over the years, some of whom are no longer alive, as you saw in the witness interviews right there, these are knockout interviews. These are people that should have been in front of Arrow,
Yes.
I think there are more than those even right there. There are about 9 or 10 of the witnesses. Yeah. Oh, you can see it. Yeah. So there are a number of interviews up there, and it's very interesting to hear these people in their own words. And so my question to you and the audience is, where do people like this go who've experienced something that we are told does not exist? And yet, as you saw there, that first picture there is of a policeman, a Bobby in the UK, who has this sighting of what he called a spaceman on the way home from work one morning at 6 a.m. Just as an example, he said the night before, people had their telescopes set up over the golf course where he lived in the UK. And these big objects are coming down. No one knows what they are. One of them lands in the nearby forest. Everyone's afraid to go out there. Well, it's his shift. He goes back to the station. Calls are coming in. And the next morning, he's driving back home at 6 a.m. His shift is over. And as he looks to the left, from my recollection, he sees what he describes as an 8-foot tall space person in a spacesuit with its arms up against the agricultural college. And he said he was glad he was off shift because he didn't want to go investigate what this creature was. But that's just an example of one of the many stories
Oh, yeah.
that exist. And there is a tendency in our culture and in our own minds, our defense mechanisms, to push experiences like this away because they don't fit the reality we were all taught to believe in. And you don't know what to do with that experience. Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters? There's no one to talk to about it. And he's a policeman, and he doesn't even know where to go to report this because there's just so far that any of our organizations that we know publicly know about these phenomena. And unfortunately, in our own society here in the US, Caroline, these topics have been classified for decades, ever since Roswell. Some people think even before that, Cape Girardeau in Mississippi a few years before Roswell. And there's even a case from Italy that seemed to have happened in the 30s. So we've been artificially insulated from these phenomena. For better or worse, we haven't had contact with even the discussion of these phenomena until recently, until a couple years ago. Congress started saying, various Congress people and senators started saying, as you know, well, what's going on here? Under the Biden administration, it really started with that 2017 New York Times article that we all know about from December 2017, where they said that there was a secret UFO program within the Pentagon.
Right.
It had been called OSAP, and then it had another name. If it's the same program, there's some debate about this. ATIP.
Didn't Lou Elizondo make that kind of famous and more notoriety? Right. Yeah.
Lou Elizondo was someone that worked in ATIP, and he resigned from the government. He wrote a book about it. It was published recently called Imminent, and it's a very interesting and readable book where he gives all the reasons that he resigned from the Pentagon. This is a kind of career counterintelligence specialist, former, combat soldier in various theaters of operation. And he leaves it all behind because he's so ticked off that what he feels is a potential national security risk. It's debatable. We don't totally know, but he felt from his information, there are objects and entities around us right now in our airspace, on the ground, underwater, so-called USOs, and life forms associated with them that people encounter, just like this policeman, Bobby from the UK. And we're not publicly talking about it. In fact, we're ridiculing it because there's been a disinformation program ever since Roswell and the National Security Act that's passed a few years later under Eisenhower. That basically classifies these sort of subjects. And as a result, we don't have proper public discussion. And he's one of the people behind the scenes that pushed Congress to start having hearings, which we've had. I think we all would have liked a little more progress by now since these started. When did these start? 2019 or so? When was the first one? It was after Black Swan Ghosts was published, which is why my final chapter may not be completely accurate anymore in terms of, I called it, you can hear a pin drop. Well, we have had a little more activity since 2017, multiple hearings, witnesses, but I know you're as frustrated as I am when these witnesses, including Lou Elizondo, goes before Congress and says, I can't talk about it. I can't talk about it. They all say, can't talk about it. I have national.
Absolutely. I mean, in the chat room, we have Dolly Saffron with us, and she's a generational contactee. And I'm not sure if you've heard of Preston Dennett, but he's a widely published.
Yeah. I know Preston. Yeah. Excellent researcher, author. I love Preston's books.
Yeah, they're great. We're going to be having them on again in a few weeks because he just wrote Symmetry 2. So I'm excited to talk to him about that. But, you've got people like this that are loved and well-known and everybody's frustrated across the board, Simeon. I mean, I feel like we're being jerked around here.
We are. No, we are. This is unacceptable. I mean, when we have congressional hearings, those people need to be subpoenaed and put under oath. And they are afraid of violating their national security directives that they've signed, their NDAs, that prohibit them from talking about this. And they feel, and this is debatable, who has the ultimate authority here? These black budget programs, the Pentagon, or the Congress? And this battle has yet to play out, because if the Congress, which funds the Pentagon, doesn't ultimately have the right to find out about these topics. Now, to be fair to Lou Elizondo and David Grush and others, they did say that they would talk about this in a secure environment, what's called a SCIF.
That's right.
The Secure Compartmentalized Information Facility. This is the bureaucratic name for this box. That is, I actually talked to someone once who built these, and he sent me the plans. They have like a foot thick of material, and then it all has to be scanned for any, microphone, it has to be secure.
Of
And
course.
it's in a Faraday cage, so the information, so they apparently talked to Congress in these skiffs, but we're not hearing what they're talking about. And is it because the information, because of this black swan ghost effect, would be so shocking and controversial to learn of the reality of this phenomena around us right now that we've never had any real legitimate public discussion about? It might frighten people enough, as Richard Dolan and Bryce Zabel wrote in their book from several years ago after disclosure. They created this scenario, and I think about this sometimes, were they right, that people might be afraid to come out of their homes. And we saw the effect during COVID. If even a
Right.
small percentage of the workforce doesn't go to work anymore, people that are involved in the critical infrastructure, truck drivers, and so forth,
Yeah, you mentioned that.
they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get the idea. And what would the effect? So, has our government decided for us that the impact of revealing this revelatory information about what we really live around on planet Earth? We don't think about this very much. We just go about our lives every day, not thinking beyond the atmosphere. And within what else, who are we around in the universe? And if we're not alone, and they're here right now, or they've been here the whole time, and they're in under the earth, in the oceans, in the sky, they're using cloaking devices. Sometimes they're not cloaking. Maybe they're even what some of these so-called drones were in your area. What would the effect psychically be on people, psychologically, I mean, to realize that when you go outside of your home, you don't know what you're going to encounter. It could be something that's from off the earth.
Exactly.
And what's even worse is your government decided not to tell you about it for 70 years because they thought you might panic. So not only do the phenomena exist, but people have been covering it up. And then the question becomes, is the cover up illegal? I mean, have people been breaking the law? And because we've had these witnesses in front of the Senate, in front of the House, and they say, sir or ma'am, I would love to talk about this topic, but I can't because I signed a disclosure agreement, a non-disclosure agreement. And we're talking about crash retrievals of UFOs. I've talked to witnesses who've been involved with those, who've looked at the materials. Most of them have not wanted to come forward yet, but they tell me it's 100% real. And the companies that study these materials are the Fortune 500 companies that we're all familiar with, that deal with chemicals and materials and so forth. We all know the names of these companies. If they were to come forward, we know, I've heard what some of them are, but I probably shouldn't repeat it. These are regular Fortune 500 large companies that have been around for a while, that the government outsources the materials to in hopes of figuring out how it works. I'm not completely against the secrecy, because the military impacts of finding out how these propulsion systems and energy systems work from these craft would have large implications. And we don't want our adversaries getting access to that technology before we find out how it works, just for the sake of national security and the future of the planet. However, if it goes too far in the direction of secrecy and compartmentalization, I'm just repeating what I've been told by people who work in these programs, it leads to a Sputnik effect, where the other side develops technology before you do, because they have their own reverse engineering programs and they're better at figuring it out than you are. And these obvious countries come to mind that would be more scientifically advanced than we are, and we wouldn't realize we've fallen behind this sort of extraterrestrial technological arms race. So there's consequences on both sides, but I mean, we do need to make progress getting the public up to speed about the reality of the situation we're in, and recognizing the national security implications all around. But at the same time, it's ultimately a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So we need to get up to speed on this topic. We need to have town hall meetings about it. And each community needs to decide what it means to them. We don't just want people panicking and thinking this is demonic or something. These are our cosmic and terrestrial neighbors. I think, Caroline, some of them are terrestrial. They've been here the whole time, and maybe they just don't feel like interacting with us yet. We just don't seem like we're worth it. And because a lot of these, we don't know.
I mean, it could be where they're in
discussion. I don't have all the answers. Preston Dennett doesn't have all the answers. He's the real pro here at getting these witness interviews, by the way. But yeah,
I mean, maybe they're in the Antarctic, and maybe they're underground. Who knows? Did you read Richard Dolan's new book about submersibles? I mean, I think it's released now.
Yeah, it's been published. I haven't read it yet, but I mean, I know some of the cases that he's referring to there. I mean, I've interviewed some of these witnesses in the past, and it's another important topic. I have had people take my remote viewing classes in Boulder, and at my in the place where I've had my office there since '96, when I started getting involved with this, '97. I had one of them. People, I love these remote viewing classes, especially in person, because people will tell you stories over lunch that you won't normally hear, and people relax. And this fellow had worked in submarine technology as a private contractor. He couldn't tell me too much, but he told me he once, I'm just being very general here. He once was on one of these subs out of Groton, Connecticut, not too far from you, where there's a big sub base. The other one, that we know about is in, Bangor, Washington. And he said he was on this sub involved with particular technology that his company had developed for the Navy. And they're under the water. And he said there was like an all quarters alarm sounded from a very fast moving object, he was told, coming on the bow of the ship, of the sub. And he said, it moved so quickly, no one on the sub had any idea what this could be. Fast moving underwater object, moving many times faster than a submarine could go underwater. Our submarines and our adversary submarines, nothing goes this fast underwater, because there's resistance from material objects to water, because water has mass. But this object was going hundreds of knots. Right. And they had it on radar, and it caused the alarms to go off. And he said, it's the type of thing that the public never hears about. And how often does this happen? And what are the implications? And are these objects spending a lot of their time underwater because they're sort of invisible to us down there? There's only so far. So it's an important issue. And I don't think we've even seen 1% of the discussion we need to have around this topic. We shouldn't be afraid of it. Whatever the truth is, it's always better than for us as adults to know the truth. And our Congress has a job to do here. They're the ones that are designed to decide what is safe releasing the information, but they can't hold it back forever. And they're really holding it back right now. And that either means this is really big and they don't feel we're ready for it, or they haven't been told yet. But I think they've heard things from Grush and Elizondo and some of the naval witnesses and the pilots and other people they've been talking to. I'm told by one of the people that organized those meetings with Congress. I was told by someone who directed these meetings that this has been going on continually since the New York Times article was published in 2017. That got a lot of alarm bells going on. The article by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper, which said that some of us suspected this, knew about this, but the Pentagon had UFO study programs. And I'm told they've been talking to witnesses ever since then. So that we're going on 8 years now of witnesses. And if they're anything like the witnesses I talked to, who I just came across randomly in the UK looking at crop circles in my remote viewing classes and at conferences, people that just, once they found out what I was interested, say, hey, I want to tell you about this. And, you're talking to them for a couple of days and they're telling you about these materials, programs they've been in. And some of them don't always give you permission to repeat it. So when it ends up in your book, you've you've changed enough details so that it doesn't identify who they are, and you certainly don't want to give away any national security secrets.
Right.
So, but at the same time, we all have a responsibility to educate the public. And, I've had discussions, these types of discussions with former Pentagon officials who err on the side of secrecy. And of course, my agenda would be just to create public discussion, because that's what makes democracies work.
Absolutely.
I don't know the outcome of this, but if we don't discuss it, we're going to be increasingly dumbed down. And that will be a big shocker on the day that this information starts to come out. It's really big. This is really big. The government doesn't want us to know their vulnerabilities and how little they know about this subject.
Right.
No organizations, speaking as a sociology, putting on my sociology hat for a second, no organizations like to admit they don't know what they should know. They're not going to admit this to their constituents and the people that pay their salaries. They want to appear like the experts, the professionals, the officials, but there's so much they don't know about this. And they certainly don't want to go in front of a camera at a press conference and say, I don't know. We don't know who they are. We don't know how the technology works, but that is the state of affairs. I think there's a lot less they know about these different species than they do know. But what we do know is they exist. They have advanced technology that's at least 1,000 years ahead of our technology, I'm told. And I think this is exciting because it means there's so many ways for us to grow and develop ourselves and for the economy to develop. Wouldn't it be great to have technologies that had less environmental impact, more environmentally friendly, were less expensive in the long run? This is a good direction for us to go in, to create less pollution, to be spending less money just in basic daily necessities that keep us going for heat and for electricity. If there were more efficient ways, let's go back to the efficiency argument. If there were more efficient ways, since everyone loves efficiency, to generate heat and electricity with less environmental impact, wouldn't we want to go in that direction in the long run? Of course.
Yeah, you would think, but look what they've done to a lot of the people that have invented those technologies, like Tesla and so on. There's a bunch of them that have developed these more efficient, earth-friendly technologies, cars running on water, and they've walked off the planet. You know what I'm saying? They've just disappeared. Do you think the government is kind of dripping this to us so that maybe we can kind of get a better grip? Because like you said, during the pandemic, everybody just hunkered down, stayed indoors, and nobody really wanted to take the chance to even walk out into the street. But before we get into that, I want to make sure that for some of the listeners that they know what Black Swan ghosts are and what Black Swan events are, because you go through a detailed explanation in your book, and you also talk about super Black Swan events. So maybe if you could just give us a 2-minute overview, because I want folks to go, what is a Black Swan event? I have, you're talking about all this stuff.
No, it's a very good question. I would encourage people to read Nassim Nicholas Taleb's books, The Black Swan, Statistical Consequences of Uncertainty, and all Anti-Fragile, which is another great book. It totally resonated with what I had studied as a graduate student. Finally, someone else was making the same arguments, that I had been thinking and put in my dissertation about how the systems we build are extremely fragile. I mean, just look at what happened during COVID to our economy, right? The government here in the US started sending us monthly checks just so we could pay our bills. If people aren't going outside anymore, a lot of people have to show up to, for work. So Black Swan events are events that have a disproportionate outcome over your expectation of what should happen. They're rare events that have a catastrophic outcome that you're underestimating. We call these tail events. And the downside of these linear regression models that are based on the normal distribution is that we're underestimating the consequences of these tail events. So a perfect example that I use in the book was this credit crash, banking crash that happened in 2008. We all remember that? Just about 18 years ago or so. Do you remember when there was this crisis that erupted? When was it? Lehman Brothers went under,
Yeah.
and these banks have these interlocking insurance agreements and credit swaps that they
Mhm.
use to insure each other if one bank, and they sell this insurance to each other, these credit default swaps, right? If somehow you default, you make a mistake, or enough people default on their loans, that they've insured you with these credit default swaps. But what happened was there was a correlation between these banks. And when one of these banks went under, now all its credit default arrangements with the next bank are now not going to work. And there was a domino effect. I really remember this weekend. It was under the Bush administration back then. And this weekend where the government had to step in and fund all these banks,
It was terrible.
or we would have woken up that Monday morning
Yeah.
with no banking system, because it's something that should never happen. But their models, this is the downside of these linear models. I remember hearing an interview where they interviewed people that do this risk estimation for these banks, that estimate the likelihood of this scenario where there's a domino effect and all the banks go under because they've all insured each other in a circle and the circle gets broken, right? So they said this was only just like that Boulder flood that supposed to happen once every 500 years. This type of event was calculated by the risk assessors who work for these banks as happening once every 10,000 years.
Oh, jeez.
So that would be a pretty long time in our future. None of us are going to be around that long. And they said, based on the 1 in 10,000 years, it seems like a reasonable risk to take to have these credit default swaps where we insure each other. The only problem was the models are underestimating the risk, and it happened. It happened a year or two after you made the models, not 10,000 years later, the next year.
Right.
And a lot of what we're around is like that. So that is a black swan event where one bank, I forgot the reason why it went under to begin with, but it leads to a chain of events where the whole system collapses, and that leads to a total credit crunch. Interest rates went up on credit cards, as we all remember. Banks have to recoup this money, and the interest rates, curiously, have never gone down on our credit cards back to that time period. They've stayed up at these astronomical rates. But again, that's a typical black swan event. COVID is not a black swan event because we're used to virus outbreaks once in a while, right? This happens every 100 years or so. There's a dramatic Spanish flu, a dramatic viral outbreak. And so that sort of happens. But the banking crash of 2007-8 is definitely an example of a black swan event. And I think this flood is sort of a black swan event because it hadn't happened in anyone's living memory.
Right.
Yeah, 500 years, 1,000 years, they weren't sure. It was part of Native American history, tradition, oral tradition, but no one had ever seen it. So the reason I call my book Black Swan Ghosts is we could talk about a credit crunch or a banking collapse and feel like I could see how that could happen, right? You can see in your imagination the banks were insuring each other and the insurance scheme came apart and they all collapsed over one weekend, or the threat of some of them. They weren't all going to, but some of them were going to. The big ones, which would have, really large unintended effects on our whole society and the whole planet. We can understand ordinary black swan events because it's in the realm of what we consider to be possible. Black swan ghost events are events that, to me, would have that type of impact. At least it would start out sociologically and culturally, the existence of other intelligent beings that may be even more intelligent than we are.
Like Roswell would be one, maybe.
Yeah. That it leads to this realization that we're around other types of intelligent humanoids, or even non-physical intelligences that we can't see. Just the collective psychological impact would be like a black swan event because it has a disproportionate effect, and it's not something people anticipated. No one anticipated that type of banking collapse. But I call it a black swan ghost event because we don't even talk about it. The black swan events we can talk about, and we can hire these risk assessors and risk managers and people that do that. I remember when I was in sociology graduate school, there were people that did risk assessment We were going to do one of these types of projects with the Hanford nuclear reactor, which wasn't far from WSU. And just in terms of comparing it to other ways other countries like the Soviet Union had managed their experimental reactors that produce plutonium and so forth. It's called an environmental risk assessment.
Right.
And this is part of social science. So you have these sort of risk assessments, even for rare events, something like 3 Mile Island or something like that. But that can be contained, and we talk about it. These black swan events that I call black swan ghost events are events that would have a pretty big impact that we're not even talking about. And it makes it even, the longer you go, Caroline, that you don't talk about it, the harder it gets to be to talk about it the following year, because we would hold our government accountable for not telling us about this. We would go, why didn't you tell us the truth about Roswell? Why did you insist it was weather balloons? And then in the 80s, they came out again. Oh, it was the mogul balloons, these
right
sonic detectors up in the atmosphere to listen for Soviet nuclear tests. Why didn't you tell us? So this has knock-on effects because it leads us to doubt the legitimacy of our own government and authority figures. And so it has these, the longer we go and don't talk about it responsibly as if it's real and leave it in the closet, the more the impact will be when we finally do talk about it. And yes, I do agree that we've had Star Trek shows, TV shows, and things since Roswell that have gotten us conditioned. You asked the question later, is the government slowly conditioning us?
Was a big one.
Which one?
X-Files.
X-Files, Independence Day, things like this. Yeah, X-Files, which I'm told is real. It was a real X-Files.
I know, I've heard that.
Yeah, I remember running into a guy at a seminar I was taking once who said his friend, this was a younger person, told him once that his parents worked for a real X-Files, tracking down, like just in Ghostbusters, tracking down.
Oh, yeah.
Extraterrestrials hidden amongst our population that looked human. And he wasn't joking. I still remember this guy's name, and he said, I'll talk to you about it again, but I didn't hear from him. But he was totally serious. There was no joking around here when he told me. You could just feel it, the vibe from him, that his parents worked for a government organization. These things probably exist. Looking for real aliens, extraterrestrial aliens, mixed in with our population. And I know this is something that Robert Odin, who's passed on now, Sergeant Robert Odin, that worked in NATO headquarters in Schaef in Brussels, told us about repeatedly. I interviewed him several times, that he had seen documents in this bunker in these NATO headquarters on one boring night where the guard said, hey, do you want to see something interesting? And it was a book detailing the 4 types of extraterrestrial species in the 60s that they knew were visiting the Earth. Yeah. NATO had done its own study because it was concerned about spies within the US government from the Soviet Union. So they did, according to Dean, they had done their own independent study separate of the US and come to the conclusion there were 4 types of extraterrestrials visiting the Earth. And one of them, the one that concerned them the most, was the ones that looked exactly like human beings. And I asked Bob, were they humans that had left the planet and come back? I don't know, in other times? Or were they really extraterrestrials that had been modified to look like humans? I mean, what was their relation? He said the book didn't say.
Lizard people. Yeah.
What did you call them?
Lizard people. They say they camouflage like into humans. I don't know.
The reptilians were another type, distinct, but maybe it was like that movie They Live. Do you remember that movie? You put on the glasses and you see what they really look like. Yeah. So here's the thing, Carolyn. I suspect that's the truth.
Yeah.
I think they're already here, and I don't want to scare anyone on the show. And I don't say this very often because I'm not in the business of scaring people. I got my Ph.D. to be an educator and to read and to understand knowledge. So I'm not in the business of shocking people, but that is my gut feeling, having talked to everyone. They're already here and they're your neighbors, and you don't know that. You don't know that they're not from Earth. They're here observing us for whatever reason. We see their craft sometimes. And I think for a lot of people that might be kind of scary because you just don't know who you're dealing with. And that seems to be what the implication of talking to Bob Dean was about, is they could already be working in our government. They could be in the West Wing of the White House. You wouldn't
Yeah.
know who they really are because they have been engineered to look exactly like humans and to study us. And I guess there could be reasons to study us. We have, these thermonuclear weapons that could pose a danger to them. So maybe that's what we would do in the similar situation to a more primitive species with advanced weaponry, is just put sleeper agents there to find out what the humans are up to. So I think that's a definite possibility. I mean,
Yeah.
has the government dripped information to us? Yes and no. We were told by our president that he was going to tell us the truth about these drones. He said this at the governor's conference in January. He said, ask me in a couple of days. I'm going to be sworn in and I will come back and tell you the truth. And give me about 24 hours. I'll come back and tell you the truth. And what were we told by his press secretary a couple of days later? These were all FAA approved vehicles. Sure.
That was such a bummer.
Sure, they're FAA approved, the size of SUVs, hovering there all night, going over Langley Air Force Base. They even shut down Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Stewart Air Force Base up the street from you in New York used to be an Air Force Base, now is an international. The FAA does not approve of flights that shut down our Air Force bases for weeks. They had to move the planes out of Langley because of these drones. Are they drones or are they some sort of advanced? I made a video about it suggesting that whatever they are, there's some sort of technological breakthrough, because I don't know of any battery technology that can lift an SUV off the ground for 6 or 7 hours for something that's that big and weighs that much. The leading contender for our batteries was some sort of hydrogen powered system or ammonia powered system that the Navy had been testing. Those things go up for an hour or two, not for 6 or 7 hours. They're not as big as these objects, where you had the state police from New Jersey and various officials, mayors from New Jersey, right?
Yeah,
saying, look,
Pennsylvania.
these things are they're dangerous. They could crash, and we tried to chase them with our police helicopters, and they easily outran our police helicopters and our police drones. So this is something more than even the police have access to technologically. And they could cloak, they could be invisible to radar. We were told, you're in New Jersey, am I right? It was your state police.
I'm right at the border. I'm like 10 minutes from Jersey, 15 minutes.
So you're right there. You're in this. I was out there on the East Coast when this was happening, just for family business. And the night I drove through New Jersey, I saw something that just didn't look right. It was just a very strange looking plane with lights in places that planes that I've seen don't have light. And it was very low to the ground, and it made a very sharp turn. And I could not find it on that flight radar app, Flight Radar 24, which shows you every flight, and you can buy a subscription and go back farther than a week. And I looked at everything that could have been around the name of the towns. It's one of the central New Jersey little cities there. And it was where a lot of the drones had been seen. I'm just driving through there, meeting friends for dinner, and there's this very strange object that doesn't show up on the Flight Radar app that looks like a plane, but Flight Radar says it didn't exist. So I don't think we're getting dripped enough, and I think they should have come forward. I mean, you're not telling there were day-long meetings in New Jersey with sheriff's departments and the FAA and the FBI, and those meetings led to no information, according to the people that were there. There were some hearings in DC, and we're even told from this 60 Minutes episode from last weekend, from someone that had talked to people in the Pentagon, they have no clue what these objects were. That doesn't sound like the FAA to me, which means we're being lied to.
Oh, absolutely.
I think we need to know This happened in my area, Colorado, Nebraska. I went out to Lyman. I made some videos. I talked to people in the town of Lyman. Everyone knew people that had seen these drones,
I read
large
about
groups of objects all night over these eastern Colorado towns. And the state police of Colorado sent up their best eavesdropping plane that detects signals and has very good sensors in it, and they couldn't keep up with them. And they couldn't figure out what they were. And even the emails, internal emails from Warren Air Force Base and the Air Force bases around Colorado Springs, when those were released from a FOIA request, the emails, they were mystified too by what they were. So there's no way it could be the FAA. They would inform all these agencies. And if they didn't, they're not doing their jobs properly. That we're, so anyway, I don't think we're being dripped enough. To answer.
Yeah, I read about that Colorado drone thing, and I read an article that they put out saying that these were Christmas, because it was around Christmas time.
Yep.
And they said that they were Christmas presents from parents. They were buying drones for their kids. Like, they put the dumbest crap out there and expect us to.
This in the New Jersey wave too. Someone said it was, people are getting early Christmas presents. You cannot buy on the market. Try to buy something the size of an SUV or a small car.
My word. Simeon, it makes me crazy. But, on the flip side of it, when, regarding the drone thing, there was a leak in the beginning. I don't know if it's a leak or intentional. Maybe it was like one of those flag things where a false flag thing.
Yeah,
they were telling us that there was a container in New Jersey port that had a nuclear device in it, some kind of nuclear materials or device. Somebody broke into it. It was like cracked open, crashed, and missing. And that all these drones were out there with this special equipment looking for this nuke material. Now, I know that was a false flag and that was BS, but they do this, the government. There's like no accountability.
No, they make up, and they've been doing it since Roswell, saying what you saw was the Venus. Right. I mean, people do mistake Venus occasionally. It doesn't explain all. Flocks of geese. It was weather balloons, ice crystals on the glass. They make up all these hokey explanations. And the radiological explanation never checked out, because I did some research into that type of medical radioactive waste from some sort of scanner, what the type of device was. We all use it occasionally. There's slightly radioactive equipment in there. It's the size of a pen. Yeah. And it's only slightly radioactive. And even a bunch of that would not be something that, it's not something you could use for any sort of weapon. It's very low grade radioactive materials that are allowed in hospitals. People who've done that type of search before said, we don't use drones for that. We use helicopters because we don't need the speed of drones to do that. We have an idea where it is, and we have equipment that hangs below the helicopter that detects radioactive material. And we kind of hone in on it with a couple helicopters or triangulate. You don't do day after day with drones. So people that have been participating in it said that explanation. And remember, there was that week where we had some guy come forward and said, I'm a drone. I work in a drone company. I own a drone. And I think they're looking for radioactive material. If that had been true, Carol Ann, they would have said by now, this is what was really going on. We're sorry if we bothered everyone overlaying the Air Force Base and Wright-Patterson and all the sheriff's department. It costs thousands and millions of dollars to deploy all those helicopters and equipment trying to find out what this is. There's no way. There is no way that that's what this is. It's a joke. And this sort of jokey explanation, it's very condescending to the American public to talk to us like that, especially about these UFO incidents where they're always using the hokiest explanations.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Anyway, we can do better. We can do better, and we should do better.
Absolutely. One of the reasons that I really enjoy talking to you, and I really want to have you back on again at some point, is there's so much. There's a lot.
There is a lot.
There's a lot. And I wanted to kind of dip into, I love the way your book enters into this whole philosophy about these black swan ghosts, because there's so much other than UFOs. You have high strangeness stuff like ghost
You do?
sighting,
Oh, yeah.
Bigfoot. Oh, and you've got, again, millions, probably billions of witnesses across the globe.
Billions
You
of witnesses. Very well
can't
said.
be crazy, right? They all can't be crazy.
No,
They all can't be hallucinating. They all can't be liars. So
that's right.
step into that world for a minute and
No,
give
I
us.
mean, no, oh, thanks. Thank you. I mean, in sociology, we have a whole category of study that we call hidden events.
Mhm.
This is a perfect example why the normal distribution doesn't work in many circumstances, because you have these extreme tail events and groups of witnesses that have not come public because they're afraid of ostracism, ridicule, and being laughed at, suffering consequences from their bosses for talking about these, especially people that work in emergency services, National Forest Service, law enforcement. They certainly don't want to be the laughing stock of their departments, and they're told often in no uncertain terms by their superiors not to talk about these events. National Park Service does the same thing with cryptid Bigfoot sightings. I've listened to these people tell their stories. They're told in no uncertain terms that you'll be fired if you talk about this. We don't scare people here at this national park. And it's the same way in police departments and so forth. Fortunately, Caroline, in the military, there has been a change in policy where the Navy has said, you don't worry, come forward with your stories. We're not going to penalize you. They have these review hearings for everyone in the military for promotion, I've talked to people in the military, promotional review hearings. Anything can interfere with your promotion. I was told even your wife inadvertently bouncing a check at the local store could affect your promotion because it reflects character.
Right.
And in that environment, are you going to want to come forward and say,
Of course
oh,
not.
we all of us in the cockpit saw this metallic object come by and we don't know what it was. It was a UFO. No one's going to do that. Now, people have come forward recently. Dave Fravor, Alex Ann Dietrich from the Nimitz incident in 2004, and those F-18 pilots, Ryan Graves, and others on the East Coast. They said, look, this is a safety issue. It's in our operating practice areas. Some of these are coming pretty darn close to our wings, and we don't want to have a collision flying at Mach 1 speed with a metallic object in the sky. And
Right.
this is the same reason that Elizondo quit, because these people were coming to him. He knew about these events before we did, working in ATIP. And it's sort of unconscionable that people are being put in these dangerous situations because we don't want to talk about it. But the whole range of a phenomenon that you're talking about, to go back to your question, are called hidden events. And what it means is things can exist. This goes back to the Gödel-Turing paradox, which is there are things that could exist. This was shown to be mathematically true by Kurt Gödel and Alan Turing. Things can exist that your models won't, your logical system won't even know about, because logical systems are self-contained. It creates these paradoxes where there are things that we know will exist that we don't know about yet. There are always limits to our knowledge. And so there are certainly these phenomena exist. The classic example in sociology is child abuse, something that we all understand.
Exactly.
And it wasn't talked about until 1965, 63, 65, where there were national meetings held by child psychologists and pediatricians and law enforcement and radiologists. And they agreed that these x-rays of these children's bones showed breakage that they couldn't explain from the kids falling out of trees or being hit by bullies or having weak bone structure. There had to be something else going on. And they finally admitted and agreed it's child abuse. This is being done by the parents. Before the 60s, child abuse was not considered a real diagnosis. No. Right. So even with a regular, ordinary sort of issue that we all find, very, distasteful, unpleasant, and bad, that shouldn't be happening to kids, we weren't talking about it until the 1960s as something that's real. And a classic example of this going back in history is meteorites. Meteorites were not considered to be real until around 1804, where a scientist named Chladni and Jean-Baptiste Biot, French scientist he worked with, went out in the fields and looked at these elliptical patterns of meteorite debris. Before that, it was considered impossible because Aristotle said there's nothing beyond the moon, so there can't be meteorites. And people said, well, Aristotle said it's impossible. So all the meteorites were thrown away from museums until one event happened in 1804 in Eagle, France. And Chladni and Biot went out to investigate Sherlock Holmes style. They walked around the villages and they talked to people. Good old style investigation. They looked at the patterns and they said, this has to be coming in at an angle. The size of it, thousands of fragments, is not consistent with a volcano stone. You know, it was thought to be volcano stones or lightning hitting stones, throwing them in the sky. This was because, of course, Aristotle said there's nothing, you know, super lunary areas, it's frozen, nothing happens out there. The planets are on these crystal spheres, but nothing's going on. Kind of this frozen idea that Earth, everything's on the Earth and nothing's beyond. You know. And this was believed until 1804. And eventually, in one event, it changed everyone's mind. Yeah. So these are called hidden events. As people are experiencing them, and they're being dismissed as peasant folklore, like meteorites were. And the same thing has happened to UFOs and all the associated phenomena with UFOs. Even within the subject of UFOs, the researchers, Caroline, have been hesitant to talk about the paranormal effects. Same with Bigfoot sightings. That there are psychic effects of being around these phenomena, electromagnetic effects, electromagnetism being something that also was considered really weird and spooky and was resisted for decades and decades. Even after Faraday and Maxwell kind of put it together, people just didn't believe there were any invisible electromagnetic fields. Where are they? You know, we just take it for granted now, radio waves and things like this. But back then, everything was Newtonian, and they were attacked and marginalized in their own day. They were very upset about this. If you read the writings of Faraday and Maxwell.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Einstein said that they didn't even teach electromagnetism in his high school in Switzerland in the 1890s. So there are things that are very ordinary, pedantic now that we accept as being real. And I think UFOs and cryptids and Bigfoot and the phenomena around them, because I think it is a type of non-ordinary, it's a kind of an extended electromagnetism. We can talk about that in future interviews. What is actually there? It was Jacques Vallée. I talked to him once at a remote viewing conference. Yeah, and we were talking outside. He was part of the remote viewing project. He knew Ingo Swan. We're talking in Vegas at the IRVA conference, International Remote Viewing Association. And he said, and we're talking about some cases. He goes, there's something they're not telling you. I said, what's that? He goes, all of these witnesses. He said, I've spoken to them. We were talking about one particular case over Ohio, the Mansfield, Ohio incident of 73, where this National Guard helicopter had a big light hovering over it, and it pulled it up into the sky. They couldn't know why they were gaining altitude. He said, well, this is what they didn't tell you in the documentaries about them. They were experiencing psychic phenomena before the encounter, the days before the encounter. And after the encounter, they all noticed psychic abilities they never had before. Even within the field of ufology, and in Bigfoot cryptid research, there has been this bias towards physicalism in order to make the subjects more scientifically acceptable. Because even people that work on the margins of science, as we currently understand it, want to be accepted by people more at the center.
Right.
So they will want their topics to look, even if it seems a little off, to be less weird. So they won't talk about the psychic phenomena. But my research has shown, talking to the witnesses in Black Swan ghosts and in Bigfoot witnesses, so many people experience other phenomena around them. Let me just talk about one particular aspect of it, which seems to be true for UFOs and Bigfoot. There seems to be an electromagnetic residue around you after you've had one of experiences that your pets pick up on.
It can make some people very sick too.
It can. It can make people sick. It can make them extraordinarily psychic. It can make them start seeing shadow entities around their homes, hear things they never heard before. On the days that the event happens, their pets will run under the bed when they come home. This shows us there is an electromagnetic or energetic effect. We can debate what exactly it is. There is some structural change to space-time being around these phenomena that affect you irreversibly. The people in OSAP called it the hitchhiker effect. The people that worked out at Skinwalker Ranch, and a lot of those people were from DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and they reported seeing cryptids in around their back in Maryland, thousands of miles from Skinwalker Ranch. So this is something we know about. Is it a hitchhiker effect? Is it an effect of being exposed? Another aspect of it that I've been looking at too are the smells around these phenomena, the smells of sulfur and other types of odors that are impossible to get rid of, even washing the clothes multiple times, which makes you wonder whether there's some sort of subnuclear reaction going on, like a cold nuclear reaction.
Let me ask you this.
Persistently going on in the you and in the materials, like the vehicle. Anyway, Caroline, it raises a lot of questions. And this is what hasn't even been discussed in these subjects at the conferences I often go to, because people are afraid of it's the same. What are they going to think of me if I talk about weird sites? So Jacques Vallée, thank you, Jacques, for telling me about this, because it got me thinking about it ever since we had that conversation.
Well, it's kind of frustrating too. I mean, 2 points. When I have a conversation, just an average person having a conversation with another person, and I mention UFOs, ufology, they get this blank look on their face. They're like, it's not above my pay grade or whatever. And they kind of shut you down really fast. So some people are more open to it than others. But take Rendlesham, right? The colonel there, what's his name? I always forget.
Colonel Halt.
Yeah. He had touched one of the etchings on the craft. And first he touched the ship, he described it. Then he touched something that was like a pyramid shaped etching into the craft. And he got this download of zeros and ones, right? He couldn't get it out of his head. And he had it, I think, for a long time. And then he was so compelled that he literally wrote them all down in a book, and they decoded that into a message. I mean, you can explain that better than I can.
It was John Burroughs, I believe.
Right. It was Burroughs.
They were under Colonel Halt, and Halt came out to the forest on one of the 3 nights where these events happened. And we have his tape recording of as he's walking through the forest. Peniston and Burroughs that encountered the triangular object. Now think how crazy that is. They see these weird lights. We know now that they were seen in the radar room at this base, which was, as far as we know, the only base in the UK. It wasn't known at the time, but it's known now that it had these cruise missiles.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and there's a connection between nuclear sites and these objects. Right. No, you're absolutely right. And we have Colonel Halt's testimony. I've seen him speak about this. I've seen Burroughs and Peniston talk about it. They were at the citizen hearing in 2013 in DC at the National Press Club, an event that was 5 days of top-notch witnesses talking about experiences like this. And there was some progress from the citizen hearing, because Burroughs, I believe it was Burroughs, was the one that had received some sort of injuries from touching the craft. I mean, we don't recommend that people, when they see these craft on the ground, go up and touch them like Travis Walton did, or the Falcon Lake incident in Canada, where that fellow, that Eastern European fellow, I forget his name, he goes up and touches the craft and it gets burned. Yeah. So there's technologies there you should not be exposed to. Gary in Black Swan Ghost, a missile security guard got burns on the side of their body.
Didn't Jake Barber get skin melting off of his arm?
Exactly. When I was listening to Jake talk about that, I was thinking, this is what Gary described. He and his colleague in their security alert team Jeep. He said everything. I have the interviews are on my YouTube channel. I welcome people to go to YouTube. Just put my name in and you'll find my channel. I have these interviews with Gary.
Link too. I'll put the link.
Thanks. I've been in touch with Gary recently. Just like John Burroughs, The VA refused to acknowledge his injuries and said they lost his medical records. And he has injuries to this day on the side of his body that was exposed on the craft, which was on the right side. Just like Burroughs goes up and touches this triangular craft. And from the citizen hearing, I forgot who it was. I think it was the senator from his state got in touch with the VA, and Burroughs got some help with this because they did say in the records it was caused by the UFO incident in his own medical records. Right. But UFOs don't exist, but the injury was caused by a UFO, just like with Gary.
Yeah.
So we wonder how many people have been injured by being exposed to the whatever sort of radiation it is coming from these objects. Dr. Helput has talked about this blue shift from the way the materials create a variable speed of light and shift ordinary light into the ultraviolet. I mean, Gary described it that way. It's a very blinding blue object. But yeah, it's very, so the Rendlesham Forest incident is just another good example in our history, in American history. You've got these 20 plus witnesses who've come forward, corroborating each other's testimony. And to this day, we still don't have any official recognition. These places, it's awful. These people, I mean, 20, how many people do you need seeing orbs out there? And,
exactly. Look at Chris Bledsoe with the videos of his, but the thing that gets me the most is we've got these military authority, kick-ass, take name kind of people like Jake Barber. Yeah. I mean, they're coming out talking about, this egg-shaped thing that I'm sure that everybody saw that video that that he was part of rescuing. And they're always undermining these people. They're always like, put it on the back burner. It's not really happening. Right. Oh, psionics. Yeah, it's kind of a real thing, but not really. Like, we can never get a definitive straight answer from our government or most governments, I think.
Right. Right. It's unacceptable. Carol, it's a travesty. These are people that risk their lives every day to do their jobs for us, to keep our country safe. We trust them with our lives. They've had incredible amounts of training. People like Jake Barber, who are helicopter pilots, had millions of dollars of training to be able to do what they do.
And yet, impeccable record, that man.
Record. And yet they are, they have their characters attacked and besmirched.
Yes.
Like,
absolutely.
David Grush did. And it's one of the weapons that intelligence agencies use to undermine the credibility of people. And they work with journalists to kind of, we've had this connection between intelligence and journalism that should never have happened going back to World War II. And we can understand during a war why you would have coordination, because you don't want the journalists saying things that maybe would be secrets and so forth. But if you keep coordinating with them too much to engineer these stories using psychological disinformation techniques, that's not supposed to be used against the American people.
Exactly.
Right? That's under certain limited emergency circumstances, we can understand that, but it's gone way too far. And exactly right. You undermine the credibility of these people. They have injuries.
Yes.
And then we shouldn't put up with this anymore. This has to stop.
Yeah, disclosure's got to come soon, if not sooner. I wanted to ask you about, and you touch upon this in your book, about, MIBs, Men in Black, right? Yeah. Now, do you think that these people are possibly alien in nature? And what's your whole take on this? And I also wanted to ask you if you think any of them are like NPCs, like non-player characters, any of these aliens that are walking around us and living amongst us today. Is this what we're referring to? Because all of a sudden, past few years, you're hearing about NPC, everybody's talking about it. I mean, have you noticed that?
I haven't heard that term. Thanks for mentioning it. I will look into it.
NPC?
Yeah.
Non-player characters. It's fascinating. Yeah, look into that. Because there's so much talk about it. And most things that I read, and
I I really don't know what this is, Caroline. I mean, the MIB stuff goes back to John Keel and the Mothman prophecies, and that
Yes.
all turns out to be very real. I read the book as a teenager and let the subject go, as I've said before, for decades, going through school at Ph.D. Never really pursued any of these topics since then. It was just interesting as a high school. We read a lot of stuff when we're teenagers, right? But I remember the MIBs in there, and all of this turns out to be things that people have experienced. I interviewed a witness, David Noble White Crow, witness to these USO type events from the Navy, many interviews on my channel here on YouTube. They are really strange, the MIBs. Some of them definitely, there's one witness in the book, Lynn Buchanan, that talks about being visited by these MIBs, which confirmed that what he wasn't sure was it a dream that really happened. They were really interested, and it confirmed to him being on a craft, being asked, shown how to pilot the navigation system, that this wasn't just a dream. But the other MIBs really have these odd characteristics that we just have to accept, talking again about the Gödel-Turing paradox. There are things we don't understand, and we don't even know how to talk about them. And the MIBs are one example where alien, what are they? They don't seem to be human. They have these stilted reactions. And
I've seen video.
I don't know why they show up. It suggests there's other players here. You're calling them NPCs that have their own agenda that may not want people talking about these subjects, not just our own government. I really don't know. There's a lot of, I'm just going to say it, there's a lot about this we don't understand. And that's okay. But we can agree it exists without trying to create disinformation and discredit the people that experience this.
That's so well said. How do you think AI fits into this whole thing? I mean, now they're talking about quantum AI technology. Google's already written articles about it, saying that these quantum chips can access other dimensions and grab information from other dimensions. Like, how do you think AI fits into this whole thing?
AI, I think, has been a bit mislabeled. It's not really intelligence like the way we're intelligent, because it doesn't have this sense of self-reference like we do. When we have a conversation, it doesn't have a feeling of having a body. It hasn't had experiences like we've had. It's a type of computation, and it's definitely a breakthrough in the sense that I use it every day. Get access to a really large swath of information and have this computer system process it and summarize it for you can be very helpful in certain areas. But it's different than true intelligence. But it's certainly something that's definitely helpful for average people like ourselves, because we can look up very specific things that might take you hours just using traditional links like we're used to from search engines, and legal questions and other sorts of information. However, in our subject area here that we're talking about, there's a lot of bias built in to what we call AI, just because it's a large language model. So it's summarizing, it's averaging what other people have said that it's been reading on the internet and the several million books that they've fed into it. So it can have bias. There was just an article I read in Science magazine that they're dangerous to AI because people can be overly confident. You can think, oh, I checked ChatGPT and I found the answer. Well, it can be wrong. I have found 10 times when it's just wrong because it's basing 80%, it's averaging, it's giving a sort of confidence. It's weighting the confidence based on the source. There are also human referees built into these programs that literally read through things and make their own decisions. So it's going to give a higher weight to like Scientific American than it is a talk given at IRVA. So it has bias built into it, and maybe Scientific American got it wrong. So it isn't the end all and be all, but certainly for many things, it can give you a lot of useful ideas that you can kind of bounce your ideas off. I don't like using it to write articles for me. Caroline, even YouTube now is suggesting the next video you should make. I love this. I'm never going to do it. Well, we think here's a good topic. How does Bigfoot affect the electrical grid? Based on your interest and your videos, we think this would be, and it gives you graphics, pre-designed graphics. This is AI at work. I don't necessarily think it knows. It might know based on its metrics what it thinks people are going to click on, but that's not my first consideration. I wasn't educated in graduate school just to write articles that are going to be popular, that people are going to necessarily like. You're supposed to tell the truth, and the truth isn't always popular. So I'm never going to create one of these AI suggested topics because their algorithm thinks you're going to get a lot of viewers. My job here is not to get the most viewers. It's to convey to the viewers I have the best idea I have about reality and the truth. It's to have integrity. It's not just to get the number of clicks. That's just like what counts the most what counts the best doesn't just count the most. That's kind of called quantifrenia. Where you just think the numbers matter over everything. Guys, there's other things besides just those are math models, these large language models. I've studied this, by the way. I've done coding before, and I know how these things work. And there are limitations. This is what's interesting. There are limitations to large language models because they're working on averages and they're biased based on what other people have written. Half the queries I put into ChatGPT, it says, well, this is a controversial sort of non-scientific topic, but here's what people have said about it. And I can find that useful sometimes. And I find when I make my YouTube videos, it can be very handy to have another title for the video, like a little snappier. And it can help a little bit. So I think it's very handy, but I think there's also a lot of hype around it from Microsoft, from Google. I love the idea of quantum computing. People like David Deutsch believes it proves the existence of parallel realities, because where are these computers where the bits are in superpositions, not classical reality we're used to, where it's either empty space or it's solid, in this sort of hyper superposition space, computing neither ones nor zeros. It's like parallel. They're looking at all the possibilities. But people I've spoken to who work in quantum computing for the government, and all these different projects that are out there, because it matters to our computer security and cryptography. It matters, and certainly in terms of the next generation of AI and so forth. Very cool stuff. I'm sure it will evolve over centuries into real intelligence with a bigger mind. Over time it would do this, but I'm told it's still far away, just because there's so much error that creeps into quantum computing. And even in the large language models we're familiar with, in the types of topics we've talked about today, it's going to get a lot of it, from my view, it's going to be biased. And this article in Science Magazine warned of biases built in, because it's just reading lots of articles and there could be bias in those articles. And we've been told this is the end all and the be all. AI, you hear about people saying, I love AI. Look, as someone that runs my own publishing business, who publishes my own books, I really like having something that can check my grammar and my spelling and alternative ways of presenting ideas. It's certainly fun to play around with, but at the end of the day, we still need humans there to be the judges. Would you want AI flying your plane?
Good Lord. I don't want them driving my car either.
Yeah. Okay. This is something that really matters to me too, because it's a related topic. It's not paranormal, but every time I hear about one of these accidents where a bicyclist is hit by one of these self-driving cars being tested somewhere, and the person they had in the car, they're legally required to have someone in the car, was just spacing out, and they didn't have their hands on the wheel like you're supposed to, and they hit somebody. And there are these accidents from various electric car manufacturers. It really bugs me, because that didn't have to happen. All accidents are a tragedy, but having a machine hurt a human like that, to me, is very upsetting. I'm perfectly happy to have self-driving cars. I spend a lot of time driving around. I go to conferences. I would love to just sit there and read. Believe me, I would love this. It takes a lot, but until it's safe, until it's really there, we shouldn't overhype these things. And when they're being tested, there was that case, I couldn't believe it, in Texas, where one of these cars, one of the well-known electric cars in the US, hit a group of police vehicles,
I saw that.
injuring an officer very badly
Yeah.
that had pulled over for another crash because the flashing lights confused the algorithm. Hello, who's programming these things? The flashing lights, it said it didn't know what to do, so it slams into this line of police cars, causing how many millions of dollars worth of damage? A lot, and injuring people. That should never happen. Why are these things being let loose on the road when they're not self-driving yet? I'm totally for this, but it's not there yet. Okay.
It's almost like the birthing process. I look at it like that. Like we're in this birthing process, and it's painful right now what we're going through. Yeah, we're giving birth to all this technology, all these ideas that people are not quite ready for. It takes a lot of mental preparation. We all have this cognitive dissonance about life, and like you said, we take for granted every day we get up and this is normal. And that word normal, everything has to be normal. You can't go outside that box. And that's another reason why I love your book, because I think it helps people expand their mind a little bit and their thought process to say, maybe these things are real. Maybe there are ghosts. Maybe we are in an interdimensional, situation. It could be.
I like her just asking the question seriously, right, without snickering. Absolutely. I'm convinced everything you just said is true. That's just my point of view based on everything I've read. Other people, viewers here may have different points of view. I'm sure if you're watching this show, you're more open to it.
Right.
You don't have to believe what I believe. I'm always up, as you know, from my books and my YouTube channel. I'm up for people making their own minds up, but at least we can have a discussion about it, because as you said right at the beginning of the show, do you think you'd have billions of people plus all the indigenous people plus Native Americans talking about these phenomena, drawing pictures of them for hundreds of years? Do you think they just were drawing something in their imagination, and yet all the other animals there on the cave wall, it's a turtle, there's a beaver, there's the Bigfoot. Do you think they made that one up? I kind of doubt it, especially they had names for this. They have stories about these creatures. It's fascinating stuff, and it's why I called my first book "Opening Minds," because this is really our challenge, all of us. So we'll have another discussion another time. We'll continue.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, you've heard about that event that happened in Florida at the mall where these dimensional aliens supposedly came in. What's your take? Because people are still kind of talking about that, and there's never any answers to it.
I don't know what happened there, because the main witnesses that filmed it disappeared. So
no way.
No, but sometimes I don't know. I just have to say there's a lot we don't know. And some of these cases, I don't know enough about this case. Some of them don't turn out to be real in the end. There are people that do things for various reasons. I don't know at this case, having looked at it, kind of cursory look at this case.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. But there are things that happen like this, and sometimes they're covered up and we never find out about it.
Right, right.
So, even if it's not real, it could be representative of something that's real. In this particular case, I just have to say I don't know. There's not enough resolution there for me to know either way.
Yeah, I agree. And
if something turns out to be a hoax or a fraud, I'm always happy to say so. I've been wrong about some of these cases in the past. People can be very convincing. They can recruit others. They can recruit publishers. It's very, derisive, and they can. It can feed on itself, and conferences are also can buy into this because they love new cases like this, and it brings in the crowds, it fills the seats. So there is this element in our area. However, in our subject matter, but the overall, it's real. And this is why you have so many pilots and professionals coming forward with their stories, whether it be Bigfoot on the ground or UFOs, or sometimes both at the same time. These are not people that make stuff up.
No, exactly. And I know you've got to go, and I appreciate your time here. In closing, what do you think the cost of denial is for society? What do you think that is? That just us being...
Yeah, there's a section in Black Swan Ghosts about that.
Yep.
I think it overall, in the long run, leads to some very negative effects of, you mentioned it before, cognitive dissonance. I think if we're not fully engaged with reality, it would begin to have detrimental effects on our evolution as a species. We wouldn't have a good sense of what's going on around us. We'd start making more mistakes in decision making. And there's only so many, mistakes you can make that way before it really starts to add up.
Yeah.
I mean, look what happened during COVID. I mean, these things can add up into various serious situations pretty quickly, where the economy shuts down and people are in a really bad state of mind. I think there were mistakes made during COVID, as we're having discussions now. I mean, even in Science Magazine, they believe a lot of these early studies were wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think it matters that we have the best reactions and decisions to the challenges that we face individually and collectively. I don't think we can do that if we're hiding from reality. I can see a logic for temporarily holding back information if it's going to lead to panic and people acting irrationally and doing things that even they later would agree wasn't a good thing to do. But that's just a temporary solution. We can't keep the Band-Aid on forever.
Right.
And the longer you hold the Band-Aid on there, the harder it's going to hurt when you take it off. So that's what I think the consequences are. It gets harder and harder with each generation. I think we can see this within science as a whole. Unwillingness to look at new topics. Gerald Pollack writes about this in his excellent book, The Fourth Phase of Water, about this phase of water that most of us have never heard about, between solid and liquid, that has its own structure, that acts like a battery, absorbs energy, and explains a lot of the strange characteristics of water that we've always been puzzled by. Why warm water freezes faster than cold water. Totally counterintuitive, but that's right. There's other water, even water itself has more complexities than we've been taught. Well, he laments, to answer your question, I summarized what I had been thinking for so long. Scientists aren't taking risks anymore because they're so concerned about promotions and grants and publications, that it's not just a constant thing. It gets worse each generation because people are less likely to want to go outside the box, and the box gets smaller and smaller. So you don't have anyone who wants to challenge the paradigm, any professionals in science that want to do this, because they're all afraid the repercussions will be too severe. So I think in the long run, it leads to like a myopathy, if that's the right word for it.
Yeah.
Is that, you know what I'm saying? Like a tunnel vision and nearsightedness, and everyone increasingly, like that story by Edwin Abbott from the 1880s, Flatland, where the rulers of Flatland know it's a multidimensional, three-dimensional world, but they don't want to tell the inhabitants who live on this flat surface that it is. And I think it just leads to...
Didn't Plato write about the cave theory, where they all lived in shadows and they didn't think the universe was anything but shadows? And it's kind of similar to that, and so it is very myopic. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think in the long run, societies that do this have a lower chance of surviving, because they'll just become too out of touch with reality, and other species would eventually take over the planet. It might have been dogs in the past if humans hadn't come along. I mean, you've read that dogs would have been sort of the most intelligent species around. They work in groups.
Yeah.
Humans weren't here, and we work very well with dogs because they're a lot like us. But there are other species around that gradually would have a better sense of reality, even if they weren't as advanced as we are cognitively. They would have better reaction. So I think for just overall survival, we need to be in touch with reality. And sometimes that means addressing painful, challenging, difficult situations. But that's what it means to be an adult.
That's such a great point. It is essential to our humanity. You know what I think would be fun if we had a conversation with Preston and Dolly, like
sure,
before.
I'm happy. Let's do a panel sometimes.
I would love to do that. I'm going to have to email them and ask them if they would, and I'll be in touch with you as well, Simeon. But thank you so much.
Okay,
I have of so many questions left to ask you.
We'll talk again. We've got more books to talk about and a lot more, and there's always some information. So thanks very much. Thanks to the viewers, and we'll talk again soon. Okay.
Thank you. Have a great one, hon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, that was an awesome conversation with Simeon Hein. And I literally have 2 pages of questions that I did not get to ask him, but definitely will be reaching out to him. And again, thank you all for tuning in. You've been listening to Ethereal Encounters Unveiled, and we are live on United Public Radio Network and the UFO Paranormal Radio Network, which is 105.3 and 107.7 FM in New Orleans. Each week, listeners will be introduced to featured guests such as Simeon and from various television shows, film, radio, authors of best-selling books and beyond. And just remember that the United Public Radio Network is a 30-year-old award-nominated, well-established FM station with a large podcast division that calls New Orleans at home. So please be sure and join us every week. I live stream every Thursday between the hours of 5 and 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I greatly appreciate each and every one of you. Always feel free to join in our chat room. We love hearing from you. We love taking your questions and comments, and we will be in touch again next week. Until then, have a blessed one. Take care.